Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be the first of the wrap-ups that I'm going to be doing for March Mystery Madness. So the first set of things that I wanted to talk about in terms of my March Mystery Madness reading were three comics that all fall into the crime noir genre, one of which probably shouldn't have been written in that style, but I'll save that one for the end. So the first thing that I read that I think was probably the best of these three series that I'm going to talk about, a story written by Ed Brubaker and drawn by Phillips, and this is The Fade Out. The Fade Out is a very classic Hollywood noir in which we have an actress who's been murdered, a pair of writers who are doing some investigating, and there is a lot of drama. There's the whole blacklisting because of communism. There's a lot of people dealing with their thoughts regarding the Second World War. They're all kind of battle fatigued, as they said in those days, rather than PTSD. There's a lot of that going on. It tries to be a little bit less stereotypical in terms of the female characters than a classic crime noir would, although we do still get a lot of the archetypes that you would be familiar with an actual period piece. As is typical of Brubaker and Phillips's work, this is a kind of gritty, realistic book. This is not a book that you would probably be wanting to read in public, but because it is quite graphic in terms of the violence, in terms of finding bodies, and there is some, not full nudity, but there is some sexual semi-nudity that, again, if you're reading this in public, you might not want to have someone looking over your shoulder. The art is fantastic, as always. I don't usually note the colorist on books. This was colored by Elizabeth Breitweiser, who did just a wonderful job. The color in this book is exceptional. If you are familiar with the usual work of Brubaker and Phillips, whether it's anything from Scene of the Crime to Criminal to some of the superhero crossover type books, you'll know basically how this story plays out. As with a lot of the Brubaker's stories, at the end it kind of peters out, but to be honest, I think a lot of that is just a flaw of trying to write a 40s style noir, 40s or 50s style noir in the current day, in which you just can't full-on go for some of the stereotypes that you could have gone for in the 40s or the 50s. Still, I thought this was a great example of this style, and if you are a fan of noir comics, or of Brubaker and Phillips specifically, you won't be disappointed with this. It is an entertaining read. I followed that up by reading another book that recalls that era, but within a different cultural and social sphere, and that was Tramp. I talked about the first volume of this a few months ago. This was created by Jean-Charles Kraehn and Patrick Jusseaume. There are 11 volumes of this, 7 of which have recently been translated into English by Europe Comics. The first 5 is a story in which a man who knows he's dying is attempting to do an insurance scam that will involve blowing up a ship. And because it's done in a kind of nautical noir style, you get a mixture of the investigative elements and kind of the femme fatale elements. This, having been written in the 90s, is a bit more dated than something like The Fade Out. This is set around 1950, so it's capturing a similar era, but this is very French rather than being very Hollywood. So it has some of those elements, which again, having been written 25 years ago, some of which is dated, not just because it's portraying the 50s, but because it is in that particular moment. Some of which hasn't necessarily aged in a wonderful way. And I will say, similarly to The Fade Out, this is a book that you might not want to be reading in public, just because there is quite a bit of nudity and quite a bit of violence. So again, if somebody's looking over your shoulder, they might not appreciate that. I will say though, this does a wonderful job of building suspense, because this is a story in which we know that we know specifically what is going to happen, but we don't know what's going to happen with the characters as they build up to it. I think the hero that we get in this story is a little too lucky in a few points, but the suspense building is really well done. I am currently in the middle of reading the second storyline within this, which I am so far less impressed with, but I have only read the first volume of that second story, so I'm not going to talk about that particularly. But this was great in terms of artwork and suspense, but just be aware that some elements of it are very dated. And finally, I read a book that really weirdly is written in a noir style, and that was Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, The Big Lie. This is written by Anthony Del Cole and drawn by Werther Dell'edera, and it takes the Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys, these brothers characters from this series that's been around for 70 years and is generally written for an all ages audience, and puts them in a more adult situation, although they are still teenagers. And it is weird. There's no reason that this needs to be the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. We also get the Bobbsey twins in a back reference. So they exist as name references, but it doesn't feel like this is bringing the characters into the modern age. There is another Nancy Drew comic series that I talked about last year, written by a different author and done in a very different style, which is also the Nancy Drew characters, Nancy, George, and Bess, plus the Hardy Boys. And I think that is updated but still captures the characters as they existed in the original books and the various revamps of the books that have existed, you know, in the past 70 years. So this is just a really odd choice. It's a passable noir comic, but it is not particularly good. It can't hold a candle to the other two that I talked about, for example. But at the same time, it doesn't feel genuinely like a Hardy Boys or a Nancy Drew story. So it exists in a kind of weird mid-zone. The art is fine, but again, I wondered why this exists in the form that it does. I can see how somebody might say, I want to write a crime noir about Nancy Drew. But there's no reason this needs to be Nancy Drew. It doesn't feel like any of those characters. And it just wasn't particularly good. This involves, basically the Hardy Boys are investigating the death of their father, and they're maybe in trouble with the law, and Nancy Drew is setting them up to do certain things, and it's fine, but there's no reason that it needed to be those characters. So I found this disappointing because I like seeing reinvented and rebooted versions of characters like this, but this just didn't do anything with them. It didn't feel like the characters, and there was no reason that this couldn't have just been a non-branded book, and it could have been exactly the same. So, yeah, a bit of a disappointment there. All right. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. And if you've been reading any other comics for March Mystery Madness, I'd love to hear how that's going. Or if you're reading actual prose fiction that's in the noir genre, I'd love to hear about that. Anyway, I hope you're enjoying this month of mysteries. That's it for now. Ciao.